Good morning. Welcome to episode 110 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. It's good to be back. I am here with Mia O'Brien, as I am each and every Thursday. Thank you to Mia for stepping in for me the past 3 days as I was out on vacation. I'm looking forward for sure to going back and listening to, especially yesterday's episode with Jordan Reed, episode 109. But each of the last 3 episodes, looking forward to going back and seeing what I missed. But today, Mia and I will be breaking down the offensive line class. You can catch Mia on our show, Helmets and Heels, each weekday on 1010XL and 92.5 FM. Helmets and Heels, 10 to 2 p.m. Mia, thanks again. Welcome to today's show, though. I'm really excited for today's topic.
Yes, very excited to wrap up our Pick the Fit series because we are officially 1 week away from the NFL draft. Thank you, Jesus, because the silly season. Before we get into offensive line, Gus, I just have to ask. I know you were on vacation. You were off the grid, or at least trying to be. Has this Ashton Jeanty discourse reached your doorstep? I feel like it actually is fitting to maybe start with Ashton Jeanty and the run game and the love affair that, well, yes, certainly there have been some of our colleagues, because Taylor Dahl wants to get it out there, and I'll put it out there for her, that she has been banging the drum for Ashton Jeanty since October as a top 5 pick in the NFL draft. And now all of a sudden he is the flavor of the week in Jacksonville.
Yeah, it's funny because it reached me via my friends who were just like kind of saw that like Jags Twitter, I guess, especially as just kind of like convinced themselves or talked themselves into Ashton Jeanty over the past 3 days or week or whatever it's been. And so I had a few of my buddies that were like, "Oh, Gus, what are the Jags going to do?" And I think that they were hoping that I was going to give them an exciting answer, whether it be Jeanty or a different name. But I was like, they're going to take either Will Campbell or Mason Graham at 5th overall. They were like, Gus, that's no fun. Boo. I already knew that. We already knew that. And so, yeah.
Thank God Gus and I are part of the resistance. My goodness. Oh, my God. Thank God bless you. Because Kevin even just came in here and he was just like, I think people are bored. Like they want, first they wanted Travis Hunter to fall and they wanted to will that into existence. And now they're trying to will Ashton Jeanty in one of the deepest running back classes of all time. And look, he may be LaDainian Tomlinson, but unless you can guarantee me he's going to be putting a gold jacket on in the next 20 years, then you can't sign up for a running back in the top 5 in 2025.
Yeah, I personally think that he's like probably the best running back prospect of the last 10 or so years, behind only Saquon Barkley and Bijan Robinson. But even then, I feel like he's like maybe not quite in their class. And even if he is, like obviously you have to have the discussion of like the shelf life of running backs, whether it's worth taking that kind of guy, especially for a team like the Jaguars, who's in year 1 of a new regime. And despite having a pretty talented roster that's better than the 4-13 record they had last year, despite them having a franchise quarterback already on a major extension, like they are in kind of a rebuilding phase right now. And so feels like it would be a bit of a luxury pick and probably better suited for some contending teams, or even teams that like, I feel like Chicago makes a lot of sense because like, even though they do already have Caleb Williams, obviously we know how much Ben Johnson loves not just a great run game, but a diverse run game, and being able to truly weaponize the running backs that he has. We saw that obviously with both Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery during Ben Johnson's time in Detroit. But yeah, I just think it would be a little bit rich. But at the same time, like I think that but Mason Graham and Will Campbell, like the 2 guys that we think will be the pick, like I think that you can make the argument for them that they're like more of like top like 15 type players, and their value is getting kind of pushed up the board because after Abdul Carter and Travis Hunter, it's a little bit of a weak class relatively, just at the very, very top. And so at 5th overall, like the Jaguars, unless they get Travis Hunter or Abdul Carter, will probably have to reach a little bit on really whoever they end up picking. And so if Ashton Jeanty is the pick, then like they were going to end up reaching a little bit on someone regardless. But yeah, I think for this team's timeline, especially, and with the fact that they already have like a offense that's going to be catered to 1 player already, and even 2 players in the passing game of both Trevor Lawrence and Brian Thomas Jr., I just feel like the fit doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's more so just that like everyone agrees that Jeanty is an awesome prospect. And so like he seems like such a high floor. And I think he is a high floor guy, certainly a high ceiling guy as well. But yeah, I think it doesn't make a ton of sense. I think it's just a little bit rich. I think it makes more sense for the Jaguars to invest in the trenches early on. But yeah, certainly an interesting conversation to have. But I think, like you said, it's kind of just draft fatigue as a whole, where like now that we are officially 7 days away from the draft, like people are kind of doing what I've been doing with Mason Graham, this whole draft process of like just trying to like be contrarian, play devil's advocate, offer new takes because it's been such a long draft process. But yeah, also like at this point, like there's so many smoke screens going around. Like I wouldn't be surprised honestly if like this hype of Genty to the Jaguars, because there is like national analysts. Dane Brugler mocks Genty to the Jaguars in his latest mock. I think Peter Schrager.
Of note, though, I do want to note, and we are going to cite Dane. Sorry to cut you off, Gus. We are going to cite Dane throughout the course of this episode as we go through offensive line prospects. Dane Brugler has the Jaguars taking one defensive line player in this final mock draft, which is unrealistic because there are way too many holes along that roster, along the defensive line. James Gladstone came out and literally told me in that press conference back in March that they plan on having their rookies, plural, along the defensive line, having the opportunity to get out on the grass early and often. So as much as I respect Dane and we're going to cite him here today, I do want to put a little asterisk on that mock draft as a collective.
Totally. I think Peter Schrager also said that like the range for Ashton Genty starts with the Jaguars at pick 5. And so it's not just that like Jaguars fans are kind of like convincing themselves or talking themselves into Genty just completely out of nowhere just because Jaguars fans alone are like bored, I guess. Like there is some national smoke, but I also wouldn't be surprised because it's smokescreen season in the NFL draft process. Like maybe even the Jaguars are the ones pushing those rumors since obviously Genty to the Raiders at 6 overall is a pretty popular fit. So maybe the Jaguars are trying to spin the wheels and maybe try to convince a team to trade up for Genty at 5, which would be a shock even if you do think that Genty is like a better prospect than Saquon or Bijan, or at least on the same tier. Trading up for a running back in the year of 2025 would certainly be a sight to see. And so I don't know. I think it's a lot of talk, and I think that's really all it is in terms of Ashton Genty. But yeah, realistically in the first round, I think it's going to come down to Mason Graham or Will Campbell. And so do you want to, before we get into Will Campbell, because I feel like that would be a good transition, but I feel like we did for the defensive line unit or the edge rushing breakdown that we did last Thursday, maybe we start out by saying, just generally speaking, what are the Jaguars looking for in their offensive line prospects? Obviously, it starts out with intangibly rich, not just the offensive line, but maybe especially offensive line. The Jaguars are going to want to bring in players that they want to coach and that are going to be able to elevate the ecosystem by being nothing other than themselves. But beyond that, Mia, what do you think the Jaguars are looking for in offensive line prospects in year one of this new regime?
Yeah, as I told you before we came on the air, Gus, speaking with Jordan Reed yesterday, which if you guys missed that podcast, it's available on demand at our podcast network, available wherever you get your podcasts, or of course here on the 1010XL Jaguars YouTube channel. Jordan said he believes not only is Mason Graham a blue chip prospect, file that one away, folks, but he also said that he believes when it comes to the Jaguars, the investments they made in free agency, what they will do in the NFL draft, he thinks that you have to look at prospects that offer either guard tackle versatility or guard center versatility. Because at this point in time, if they had to roll the ball out tomorrow, the Jaguars could line up with an offensive line that at this juncture, they're pretty confident in. And so that is where you're planning for the future and you're creating more competition, as Liam Cohen and James Gladstone explained across the board. Tony Baselli echoed that sentiment in the EV podcast with John Osher on the Jaguars channels too. I like the point that Hef just made. Big, powerful, run-blocking offensive lineman. I think that goes without saying, especially if you've listened to Baselli at all over the last year plus. But what I think is going to be interesting as we go through this exercise, I have a couple different buckets, as I have the last few episodes as we've done Pick the Fit. But I think what's interesting is after I get past the, okay, if they're there, you have to have a conversation. And after the, this is a good third round crew, you get to a bucket that I have identified as the big, massive, maybe questions in pass pro, but mauler dudes that you have to bank on your coaching and say, hey, could we get the most out of this player outside of the short area field? Because they excel in pulling across the line of scrimmage. They excel in quickly getting off the line, but it's in that wide zone blocking, getting downfield that maybe there are questions, as well as pass blocking. And so that tier, to your point, Hef, is where I found myself gravitating towards the 6'6", 320 plus pound offensive lineman that I'm curious that, considering the buzz that I've heard coming out of the Miller Electric Center and around the league, that the Jaguars are looking for big people, does that connect with that particular tier?
Yeah, we've talked about girth a lot on former shows, and I think that it's important to bring up as like a trait that is not teachable. Like you got to be able to have guys that are like have girth as in size and mass, and then also toughness and smarts. And like those things are the things that like maybe you can like throw him in an NFL strength and conditioning, like weight room and stuff like that, and add a little bit of strength and develop guys' anchor a little bit. But really, again, girth as well as toughness and intelligence, I think are things that like you're really scouting for. And then like you can clean up some like technical refinements of prospects' those areas. But yeah, I think girth and size is like, as much as it seems like a buzzword, and I guess it is a buzzword, it's really important to be able to have those kinds of players as prospects, because it's just hard to teach that or hard to develop that. And so I think that's a good segue into the first guy that we'll talk about today, which is Will Campbell, which is someone that we expect to be the first overall pick or the first round pick for the Jaguars, assuming it isn't Mason Graham. I think Will Campbell, the best trait that he has is what you start out with, is the versatility, where like there's definitely a lot of debates across just the draft industry about whether Will Campbell will be best as an offensive tackle, which he played for 3 years, all 3 seasons as a starter in the SEC. And then for all 4 years, he was a starter at the high school level at left tackle and a little bit of right tackle too, I believe. And so is he going to continue to be an offensive tackle at the next level, or is he going to be best maximized as an interior offensive lineman? And I think that he probably would be best maximized as an interior offensive lineman because of not just his short arm length, but also because of his mediocre anchor. I think usually when you have offensive linemen who have short arms, it's like not the end of the world, but you'd like them to be able to like make up for that weakness with a strength more than anything else, a great anchor. But like Will Campbell, like if he isn't able to win like with the initial kind of latch on to defensive linemen, then he can easily get driven back. He also is not great playing on an island because he has a little bit of an upright and stiff kind of like set, and so he can overdrift a little bit, and can be really. He can allow a lot of kind of inside counter moves. And so by putting him kind of in a phone booth and kind of lessening the margin of error for him, then again, it goes back to he will probably be like an average offensive tackle or so, which would be very valuable because there's not 32 of those in the National Football League in the year of 2025, or really any year. But he really has a much higher ceiling and even a higher floor too inside. But it's not just like, oh, he would be better at a right guard than right tackle, or left guard than left tackle. It's he can play left guard or right guard or even center. And so like that versatility again is something that I think the Jaguars will really want, especially because they already do have 2 kind of theoretical bookend tackles in Walker Little and Anton Harrison. I think that Armand Membu is certainly a guy that we've talked about a lot on the show, and someone we can talk more about today. But even if you think that Membu is the best offensive line prospect in the draft, I think that Will Campbell would probably be the top offensive line prospect for the Jaguars. Again, because Membu, I think, is like a plug and play, like long-term bookend tackle from day one. So he would make a lot of sense going to New England, where they don't necessarily have that, and they want to be able to protect their own franchise quarterback and Drake May. Whereas, again, the Jaguars already have 2 tackles. And so taking Membu, who could also kick inside to guard, I just feel like it doesn't make a ton of sense to do that now and try to solve the offensive tackle issue as much as you can when there's so many holes throughout not just the rest of the depth chart, but also on the offensive line too. And so right away, Will Campbell, I think, could compete either at either tackle spot for that starting gig, but probably more so he would compete with Ezra Cleveland to be the starting left guard as soon as 2025. And then if Anton Harrison or Walker Little go down, then you can potentially plug Will Campbell into either of those spots. If Robert Hainsey goes down at center, then you could plug in Campbell there over Luke Fortner potentially. And so the versatility that Campbell provides, it's the versatility and then the football character in terms of him being a back-to-back team captain. He was the first ever lineman on either side of the ball at LSU to be awarded the number 7 jersey, which is always given to like the most electric playmaker. So he was awarded the number 7 jersey each of the past 2 seasons. Again, was the first lineman on either side of the ball in LSU history to have that happen. But he did have to play with the number 66 jersey just because of SEC jersey rules. And so, yeah, he's like, I heard a guy say that like Will Campbell was like texting his LSU coaches at like 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning being like, here's a cut up of Trent Williams. Let's work on this in practice. Here's a cut up of Penei Sewell. I want to learn how to do this technique in practice. So everything you want in terms of versatility and football character, even if he doesn't have a super high ceiling as a like future Pro Bowl long-term left tackle, he certainly seems like a future just long-term Pro Bowl offensive linemen, and that seems like something that would be hard to pass up for the Jaguars.
I love Gus putting the Will Campbell agenda out into the ether, trying to convince Jaguars Twitter to take a step back off the Ashton Genty line. I'm here for it. Because I agree. I think that ultimately he's just a good football player. And Gus, if you could pull up Rateus's comment about would Will Campbell elevate the starting offensive line more than Mason Graham elevates the starting defensive line, I think that's the amazing thing. And it's part of why Gus and I remain in this camp when it comes to the Jaguars' number 5 overall pick. I believe they're the same player, just one's on offense and one's on defense, in that they both offer you versatility. They are both just turn on the tape, plug and play guys. We have been talking about both of these prospects since they were true freshmen making an impact at their respective universities. And we're just bored of them because they are 3-year starters in the 2 most powerful college conferences in the country on 2 perennial powerhouses. And for me, it's just hilarious that we've gotten to this point in the discourse where we have to come away from 2 players who I think are the highest floor, arguably, in this year's crop. Now, the one asterisk I will give you. Heard some smoke. Mike Vrabel, he's not going to let Will Campbell slip unless something weird happens at 4. And once he drafts him, he may invite him to come live with him and his wife in the Vrabel's new house up in New England. And so knowing that their college-age sons have all graduated and moved on either to university or to a National Football League career, professional career. So they're all out of the house. And so Will Campbell may be invited to live in Mike Vrabel's house. And so that's again, I've seen buzz out of New England of maybe we should take Ashton Genty. No. Mike Vrabel, while not necessarily from the same school of thought as Liam Cohen and James Gladstone, is from that same rational line of thinking of just take the best player available, turn on the tape. If he's a competitive freak, he can play multiple positions. Just take him. If he's a 2-time, 3-time captain, he's going to elevate the ecosystem. Stop overthinking it. And so in my estimation, that's why Will Campbell is going to go 4th overall and Mason Graham's going to go 5th overall. I apologize for squashing the dream because that was such an impassioned argument that it just warms my heart. And as Dell says, you look refreshed, Gus, and you're ready to push the Will Campbell argument post-vacation.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, for Big Cat Country, we do like a site-wide first-round mock draft at SB Nation. And so to represent the Jaguars, I had the 5th pick, and the Patriots in the mock took Armand Membu. So I took Will Campbell over Mason Graham. But I do agree with you. I'm expecting Will Campbell to be the 4th overall pick to New England, which would more than likely, or more likely than not, open the door for the Jaguars to take Mason Graham at 5th overall. So before we move on to other first round or other non-first round offensive linemen, just to throw out other names, we already talked about Membu. I think Josh Simmons is really interesting. I think you can make the argument that he's the best offensive tackle in the class in terms of tape, especially 2024 tape. But he is a little bit of a 1-year sample size because the tape improved massively for Simmons from 2023 to 2024. There's also a lot of like kind of injury concerns. Teams are going to have to check out medicals with, I believe it's a back injury for Simmons. And then I think he's also might not be intangibly rich. I heard someone say that he's the kind of guy that like might get his second contract and then kind of kick his legs up. And so I think the Jaguars obviously are going to be looking for someone with a little bit more drive. And then Kevin Banks is the other kind of offensive line prospect who would probably be taken at some point in the first round, maybe even as high as 5th overall to the Jaguars. But his contact balance is really a concern, I think, kind of similar to Evan Neal, who the Giants took at 7th overall a few years ago and has really struggled in the league. And so Kevin Banks, to me, is more of like a bottom of the first round type of player than a top of the first round type of player. And so do you think that any of those guys or even anyone else could be like a sleeper name to watch? I guess especially if the Jaguars move back in the draft, or do you think in the first round it's pretty much Will Campbell or bust for Jacksonville?
I'm not even doing any work on those guys, and maybe now that I'm not doing any work on them, that's who the pick will be, and the Jaguars will find a trade partner, but I don't expect that to happen. To be honest with you, Gus, my tier of guys below the Will Campbell conversation, because I'm not even going to put Armand Membu in that conversation, because I do believe at this point in time, well, yes, as I've said on this podcast, this is a big year for Anton Harrison to prove to the new regime that he should be a pillar and a cornerstone of this franchise. You can make the same argument for Walker Little. Obviously, the dollars and cents, a little bit different for the former first-round pick versus a guy who just got paid last year, whether for better or worse by the previous regime. So for me, this next tier I want to talk about, one of these names I think does sneak into the first round, and that's Donovan Jackson, the guard out of Ohio State, a guy who, unfortunately, because of injury, maybe people are forgetting about, but much like his classmate, they're both seniors, his former teammate, Emeka Ibuka, on the wide receiver front, how all of a sudden in the last 2 weeks, people, kind of like Will Campbell and Mason Graham, have come back to, oh, that's right, he's a pretty good football player. Yeah, he's had a championship pedigree. So I think Donovan Jackson would be a name to watch for if he slips to the second round. I think there's a chance he goes ahead of Tyler Booker and Gray Zabel. I've heard that from a couple different sources around the league. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. The other two names that I've kind of lumped together as, hey, I don't think the Jaguars, outside of the Will Campbell potential, which for me is probably at like 6-7% right now, I would maybe even put the Ashton Genty agenda, dare I say, 8 to 9%, and then Mason Graham, the rest of and we give Jalen Walker like 5% chance of going with the 5th overall pick. The next two names, I don't know if the Jaguars will strike this iron when it is hot, just because I think they are happy with the free agent signings that they've made. And it's not to say, as Tony Baselli talked about with John Osher earlier this week, they want to make that room as competitive as it can be. But ultimately, I don't know if the match fits the need right now. That's Jonah Savanaia, who I wrote about at Mia's Mock Draft Monday last week. We talked about it on Monday. If you guys want to go check out my write-up, head on over to 1010xl.com. For me, guard tackle versatility, like we said off the top, I think that's going to be paramount with whoever this pick is for the Jaguars. If it's multiple, whether it's just one or two on the offensive line in this year's NFL draft. He plays with a mean streak. He's 21 years old, captain, checks a lot of boxes. The other name that I'm interested, and again, like I said, I do not believe that this regime is going to go out and draft a tackle and say to Anton Harrison and Walker Little, you're on notice. I just don't see that happening. I could see in the 3rd or the 4th round drafting one, and that's enough of a shot across the table of, maybe you got to pick up the pace here. And if they do, and if we are to stay with that thought process of, hey, bigger guys, Ozzie Trapillo out of Boston College, who comes from a multi-scheme, faceted offense by Bill O'Brien in terms of the run game. They ran a little gap. They ran a little zone. He makes a ton of sense. Obviously, championship pedigree. His late father, was an NFL offensive tackle as well. 6'8", great pass pro. I would argue of all the names I'm about to give you, pass pro is perhaps the biggest deficiency of a lot of the matches I have found for the Jaguars, but not this cat. That's probably his biggest strength. And so I think that those are in that first tier for me, past Will Campbell, of they're a fit, but I don't know if the Jaguars will actually go in that direction because they have other needs.
Yeah, similar to Donovan Jackson, Tyler Booker was a name that I had written down as someone who, like, if he ends up slipping out of the first round and all the way to 36 overall, then I would assume the Jaguars would seriously consider taking him, especially with the caveat of they don't take an offensive lineman, i.e. Will Campbell, in the first round. So if they take Mason Graham at 5th overall, and then one of Tyler Booker or Donovan Jackson falls to 36, I think that makes a lot of sense. Booker,
I had some folks in the building telling me exactly that yesterday, of like, how can you in good faith, if either of them are there, say no? As much as we have spent the last 3 days while you've been on vacation, Gus, my agenda, my banging the drum has been, it will be a wide receiver at 36. It will be a wide receiver at 36. If one of those two cats are there, you just have to say, well, I have to take them.
Yeah, absolutely. Booker, I've seen apparently inside of Alabama's building, he's considered the Will Anderson of the offensive unit. He's kind of being pigeonholed, and understandably so, as like a gap scheme player, because he has great size, great girth, again, that like can't be taught. Certainly a tenacious and tough player, very physical player, but because of his size and has like a little bit of slow feet, he's not necessarily like a great scheme fit for any scheme. He is going to be someone that's better not moving out in space a ton, and more so just like playing in a phone booth. He can pull out a little bit as a puller into space, but like really, like you want him just maul people one-on-one, as opposed to being like a true everything player. And so that would probably be a reason for him slipping. He's got, again, like slow feet, but also a pretty underwhelming athletic profile from his NFL combine showing in general. And so I think because of the kind of relative lack of athleticism, that would be what causes him to fall. Lack of athleticism plus like not a scheme versatile player. And so maybe the Jaguars would want someone that is a little bit more versatile, since we have talked about versatility being so important for not just offensive line, but pretty much every position group for the Jaguars, something that they're looking for. But yeah, I think Tyler Booker and Donovan Jackson, certainly two names to watch out for at 36 overall. Really likes the other names that you brought up too. The other kind of day two guy that I like a lot is Marcus Embo out of Purdue, who is another guy kind of like Will Campbell, where it's like I feel like every other person that I see like write up of has him projected at guard, and then the next person has him at tackle, and they like flip flop, snip snap. But like Embo, he has great feet, great athleticism. He's arguably like that most tenacious player in the draft in terms of like finishing ability and playing through the whistle and stuff like that, or at least along the offensive line prospects group in 2025. He does have not great girth, not great mass. He's a little bit lean. And so I think that maybe that's what the argument is in terms of pushing him inside to interior offensive line, because even if he is going up against like bigger and more powerful interior defensive linemen, they're not going to have like the acceleration as edge rushers have. And so like if you're thinking, I guess Newton's second law of whatever it is, Newton's second law, where it's like
of averages, yes.
Yeah, force equals mass times acceleration. And so even though he would be going against guys with more mass in the interior, those guys aren't going to be able to accelerate as quickly because you're playing so close to them. Whereas along the edge, like even if it's, again, guys that aren't as girthy or have as much mass, they have another step or two to build up acceleration. So arguably you're dealing with more force out on the perimeter. And so, again, like he's going to have to clean up his frame a little bit and get a little bit stronger. But I think that makes sense for him as like a day two kind of developmental prospect for the Jaguars, as someone who could be plugged and played at a couple of different spots if needed be. But he, like I guess in the best case scenario, he just wouldn't see the field in year one if there's not a lot of injuries, but then would be a potential future long-term starter for the Jaguars. But he's a guy whose profile just stands out to me in general, but specifically for the Jaguars as well.
Here's the interesting, I think, to your point, I think Marcus Membo and I think Armand Membu and Marcus Embo would be the pick for the Jacksonville Jaguars if Trent Baalke was still the general manager and if Phil Rauscher was still the offensive line coach. I firmly believe that those are two guys that fit the idea of the measurables, the athletic testing are off the charts, getting out in space in a zone blocking scheme. Those two guys fit that for me more than what I believe we are about to see take place in a multi-scheme running attack for under Liam Cohen personally. Now, and so that's where the name that I have circled in that next tier, and we'll get to Tate Ratledge here in a second, even though I think we've talked about him a ton on this podcast. We've also talked about this next name a ton, especially yesterday with Jordan Reed. You can go back and check it out if you guys didn't catch that. We had ESPN's Jordan Reed on yesterday, and he, like me, is all in on finding someone with guard tackle versatility for the Jaguars somewhere between the third, fourth, fifth round. And we're on the same wavelength because the ESPN simulator is not. It has this guy as like a 6th round pick. Jordan and I have him as gone by pick 95, and that's Wyatt Milam out of West Virginia. One of 2 offensive linemen in 40 years to start as true freshmen along the front for West Virginia. The other is Zach Frazier, the one who got away for so many of you in the comments in Jaguars Twitter right now. Because he obviously had a pretty solid rookie season with the Pittsburgh Steelers and fits that identity. I'm not saying the Jaguars are going to try to recreate what the Steelers have done over the last 50, 60 years, because I think Zach Frazier is a Steeler. But if you are looking to take some semblance of that physical identity, then certainly picking from the same well wouldn't be the worst idea in my opinion. Wyatt Milam, his last sack allowed, mind you, he's a 4-year starter. He's a true senior, so he's 22 years old. The last sack he allowed was his freshman year in the bowl game. So it has been 3+ years, much like Will Campbell, since he last allowed a sack. He's an elite competitor. He's got the wrestling background, strong hands. His pass pro was exposed a little bit at the Senior Bowl. And that's where I'm so fascinated, Gus, again, to go back to Embo and Membu. I am so fascinated because the draft picks we have seen over the last 5 years under Trent Baalke, ballerinas, dancing bears when it comes to pass protection. That was their strong suit. I believe you are going to see the Jaguars decide, hey, if you are a mean mauler in the run game, we will teach you pass protection. Now, the slow feet argument certainly can be made. And well, if they have slow feet, can you really teach them pass pro? But if you believe you are going to be an offense that is predicated on the run, I believe you will see a different offensive lineman be drafted by this new regime.
Yeah, I feel like this is probably a poor oversimplification, but I almost think of Wyatt Millam as like a poor man's Will Campbell, or like at least in terms of the guard / tackle conversation, where I think the main reason that Will Millam would slot inside to the interior is mostly because of his short arms. And like, it's not just short arms alone, but like the short arms is a big weakness that like kind of is like has a confounding impact on like the rest of his game, and he isn't able to make up for that weakness with other elite traits. But he's a guy that like would probably be a great interior offensive lineman, but like Campbell has the ability to flex out to tackle if need be in a pinch, whether it's due to injuries or whatever else causes your starting offensive tackles to go down. So definitely love that shot. I think he's one of the best examples of a guy that like would probably be best at guard, but he does have the versatility to cook outside as well.
Exactly. Now, the Tate Ratledge argument, real quick, because we've got a bunch of other names that I want to run through and not a ton of time. Tate Ratledge, we've exhausted that argument. He is the mullet man out of Georgia. This one blew my mind. Out of 1,730 offensive guards who have been tested by their raw athletic score since 1987, he ranks 8th all time. And for me, that is stunning, Gus, because the MO of Tate Ratledge is he is that mean mugging in the run game, I'm getting after it, beefy guy up the middle. You don't think of him as one of the most athletic offensive guards who have ever gone through the pre-draft process, but that's what he is. Now, what's interesting is if you draft Tate Ratledge in the 3rd round, if you are the Jaguars, you are saying, okay, he's going to be a starter by year 2. Either you're getting out of Ezra Cleveland's contract after year 2, maybe you're putting him on the trade block. Maybe Patrick McCarry is sliding elsewhere along the offensive line. And so that's why a selection of Ratledge, much like we were talking about with Ozzie Trapillo, if you take Trapillo, that's sending a message to Walker Little and Anton Harrison, even if it's not a 1st-round pick of, hey, you got to step up your game here. I think the Ratledge selection would be, hey, this is our guard of the future. Whereas Milam, yes, he's also your guard of the future, but you also can operate under the guise of we want guys who can do a little bit of everything, who are crazy competitive. They make the room better. So I did want to give that shout to Ratledge. And I've got one other name that is a bit of a polarizing prospect. I've seen some national pundits who I respect have him as a 3rd, 4th round guy. Some have him as a 5th, 6th round guy. That's Jackson Slater out of Sac State, 6'3", 311, small school guy. But he also earned recognition that no other Big Sky Conference guard has ever gotten before. He held his own at the Senior Bowl, despite being out of Sacramento State. Blocked certainly for Cam Scadaboo once upon a time. He's always looking for work, strong core. Again, he's not quick on his feet. He's got great pass sets. I would compare him, and I know this is apples and oranges. We talked last week, and you guys can go back and listen to last week's episode on demand. We talked last week about Jack Sawyer and how he's just a good football player. He's not going to win any athletic freak contests, but he's going to find a way to be in the league for 7 to 10 years just because of the competitive motor and just because he's a good football player. I would say that Jackson Slater, despite not having the Ohio State name on his resume, I think he's the Jack Sawyer of offensive line. So I don't really know which of my tiers to put him in. So before we get to the massive mauler dudes with guard tackle versatility, let's just throw Slater out there too.
Love that one. He's definitely one of the more popular like mock picks that I've seen, especially by Jaguars fans. I feel like it's like him and RJ Harvey. And then the next guy, Charles Grant, was one that I had in mind. So I wanted to ask you about him because to me, he's like the ideal developmental offensive tackle where he's got great size, incredible length, really good fluidity, really good athleticism. And so he's like got certainly the frame and the like kind of toughness mindset and the intelligence to be like a future starting offensive tackle. But because he played at William and Mary, he faced really weak competition. And he also, kind of similar to Mbell, doesn't have great girth. He definitely needs to get stronger in order to succeed at the NFL level. And so that's a guy that I think you can just get into your building, have him get stronger over a year or two, and then maybe down the line he can be a starter for you. But I do think that he's probably just going to be an offensive tackle and might not have as much versatility. And so to me, like, again, I don't think that Mbell makes a ton of sense for the Jaguars because he seems like such a great offensive tackle prospect alone, and I don't think he necessarily needs to kick inside. I feel like Charles Grant, again, gross oversimplification, maybe is like a poor man's Membu, where I think he's just an offensive tackle, and even if it takes a little bit of time for him to, again, build up some more NFL-type strength, he could be a future bookend tackle. And so do you think the Jaguars would be interested in something like that profile later in the draft to, again, apply a little bit of pressure at least to Walker Little and Anton Harrison? Or do you think that, kind of similar to what you've been saying, they would say, even if they like Charles Grant as a prospect, they would value versatility more than anything else, and maybe that would drop Charles Grant down their personal board a little bit?
I mean, here's my thing. Like, first off, the previous regime already had questions about Javon Foster, so I don't have him making the roster. The Jaguars went out and signed 2 tackles, and I know Chuma Edoga has inside-outside versatility, and Patrick McCarry has inside-outside versatility, but then they still went out and signed Fred Johnson, who is a tackle. And so that's where I just don't see the Jaguars drafting even a developmental tackle. I wrote about Logan Brown out of Kansas last week with Mia's Mock Draft Monday. Mm-hmm. Again, tackle-only prospect, athletic as hell, much like Membu. Again, I just don't see it happening. If anything, and I think the most revealing part of the hunt by the Jaguars in-house video team for me was that Cooper Hodges was walking around in meetings, like in the weight room, lifting. And I was like, oh my God, like I haven't talked to Cooper, but that is a massive development for me if he could be healthy at some point in the 2025 season, because now all of a sudden you have that guard center future guy if this new regime believes in him. And so that affects directly, are you even going to take that guy on day 3? Or on late in day 2. And additionally, because you went out and you signed all these veterans at tackle to back up your 2 still young starting bookends, like I just don't see a world in which they draft someone who can really only play the one position.
Understood. Well, 2 other names I had written down but didn't have the time to really dive in deep was Willie Lampkin out of North Carolina and Luke Kandra out of Cincinnati. Definitely 2 later round guys, probably day 3 guys I'm going to keep my eye on just because I think they're solid day 3 prospects in general. But it's your time now, Mia. Unload the notebook. What other day 3 names or just late round names do you have as potential fits for the Jaguars?
I'm kind of surprised you didn't have these next 2 names. It is time to talk about, as I have teased throughout the duration of this podcast, the big towering interior, but could kick out in a pinch lineman that the Jaguars could target in the late 3rd, 4th, 5th round. One, we're bringing him home. Jalen Rivers, the Oak Leaf High product, of course, a 4-year starter down at Miami. Left guard, left tackle in the same football game. You can sign me up for that one. 6'6", 319 pounds. He's massive. A lot of the problems that you outlined with Tyler Booker, you will see with both Jalen Rivers and this next prospect I'm going to talk about after him, who's in the same tier. Again, when you're in the backfield in short yardage areas, these guys, the quick first step is on display. Great puller, able to get out in the run game, going from north to south. Good anchor, but ultimately, once you get them out in space, what are they actually doing there? And so Jalen Rivers is the one. Miles Frazier, a Senior Bowl standout out of LSU, is the other. He started at FIU, was a left tackle before transferring to LSU, where he played guard. 6'6", just like Rivers, 317 pounds. The comp that Dane Brugler gave him and Lance Zierlein of NFL.com as well was Jonah Jackson, which I thought was interesting. You watch the tape. He cleans up the pocket. He can get from left to right along the offensive line, and he certainly is always looking for work. I think, again, the question is, that's within the short yard, 10-yard phone booth. What happens when he actually is asked to step out in zone and actually get out in the run game? That's the biggest question for him. 0 sacks and 544 pass pro snaps last season. Again, guys that you turn on the tape and they just look physical and the stats back it up. And so that's that next tier for me of if this profile of the Jaguars want big people, the smoke that I've been hearing for the last 2-3 months, if that is to be believed, I think both those guys could be a fit, especially in that 4th round.
Yeah, and I think that overall archetype makes a ton of sense for the Jaguars, not just because you've been hearing it personally, but also when you look back at both the Bucs and the Rams, like what they've done in recent off seasons. I feel like they've been really going after maulers, especially in the interior offensive line, but really across the offensive line for the Rams. They really rebuilt the interior offensive line in recent years, partly because they kind of had to. It wasn't a very talented unit, but also they wanted to make sure that they could get back to more like inside runs, like duo and gap scheme stuff as the league kind of transitions a little bit away from wide zone running schemes, just because NFL defenses have kind of caught up a little bit in terms of how to guard that. And so now they're even people like Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan, who like ushered in this era of like wide zone offensive schemes in this modern age of football. Even they are kind of going away from that and just adapting towards more gap man-oriented blocking schemes and just really trying to get downhill. And so in order to get downhill, it helps to have those maulers. Again, in Tampa Bay, when you look at picks like Luka Decky, Cody Mock, I guess Graham Barton isn't maybe you wouldn't categorize as a mauler, but he is a center playing now.
He's a big human being who had 5 position versatility.
Yeah, he did play offensive tackle in college. And so, yeah, I think when you consider, again, both what you're hearing personally as well as what we can look at in terms of previous actions from the Rams and the Buccaneers, I think this archetype of offensive lineman definitely makes a lot of sense for Jacksonville.
And I do want to note, too, bringing these two players together with Ozzie Trapillo out of Boston College, who we spoke on earlier, 6'8" for Trapillo. Rob Havenstein, once upon a time, a second-round pick of Les Snead in the Los Angeles Rams, 6'8". So you can kind of tie those two things together if you want to. This next tier, I'm just going to call it the Georgia tier. And we already talked about Tate Ratledge. Again, you could go back and listen to that if you want to. And we've talked about him on previous Duval Rundown episodes, Gus. But I have been fascinated the last 48 hours or so and have gone back after listening to both Dane Brugler and Daniel Jeremiah speak on Dylan Fairchild, the other guard for Georgia. 2-year starter at left guard opposite Tate Ratledge, 6'5", 318 pounds. He's thick. Both Jeremiah and Dane Brugler rave about this guy on the Athletic Football Show earlier this week. Their comp is Wyatt Teller. They believe that he's a guy who, because he was only a 2-year starter, because he was banged up part of the time, he is someone who his best football still could be ahead of him. He's the opposite of a lot of these guys that I'm going to run through. He's not necessarily the run blocker, despite the fact that he was a 2-time state champion in wrestling, a 67-0 record in high school. He is actually more known as a pass protector. Puller, he allowed 1 sack, 1 quarterback hit, 7 hurries, and 876 pass pro snaps each of the last 2 seasons. Again, I'm just so fascinated by this guy because I do think his best football is ahead of him. The ironic part is the other player who had put in this tier as a 5th round selection potentially for the Jaguars to look at is Clay Webb, who couldn't get on the field at Georgia. So he transfers to Jacksonville State, is an immediate starter for Rich Rod at left guard his entire tenure there. But what's fascinating with Clay Webb is that he was the highest rated center prospect in his high school class coming out, couldn't get on the field at Georgia. I mean, ultimately the Jaguars signed Robert Hainsey, who lost to Graham Barton in a competition last year. So again, I don't think like just because you lost a competition, the Jaguars therefore like take you off the board. 6'3", 312 pounds. Again, he's fascinating to me because you don't see draft analysts saying, hey, this guy played guard or this guy played tackle and he should play center every day. I feel like we're used to that because of Graham Barton and now Gray Zabel and his emergence. Yes, folks, I see Gray Zabel in the comments. He's not going to be there at 36 unless the Jaguars like trade back to 15. The dream is dead. I'm sorry. But Clay Webb is interesting, though, because Lance Zierlein believes he has the best core strength of arguably any offensive lineman on day 3. Really solid anchor. So maybe he does make that move back to center, but he offers you that depth at guard. And that's where the Cooper Hodges conversation comes in. How healthy is he? How much do you believe that he could be part of your future? If you have reservations, and look, the Ben Barch example is the best that we have in recent memory of the Jaguars banking on a player to come back from significant injury and being asked to do a little bit too much and floundering, that's where I wonder, hey, can you take a flyer on one of these two cats with championship pedigree in the 5th round to supplant, and not supplant because you would keep Cooper Hodges around, obviously, but to add depth to that room?
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. I think for Fairchild, like there's some questions about processing in both aspects, run and pass game, but like he certainly has the size, the athleticism, the power, the demeanor, a lot of the just like things on a profile. He checks a lot of boxes as a guy that like you just want to bring in as a late round pick and try to develop in your own building. And so I think he is a guy that kind of like is a little bit landing spot dependent, not because of scheme versatility or like landing in the best scheme, but just landing in a place that he will be able to develop. And like, even if he doesn't necessarily get playing time, he just needs some time to develop as an NFL football player. But again, checks a lot of boxes for sure. And so I think, as you're saying, it makes a lot of sense to bring in a guy that's like almost competing less against like the starting group in Jacksonville and almost more so competing against Cooper Hodges to be like the main interior backup lineman.
And potentially a starter down the line. Wouldn't have the assurance of if you take Tate Ratledge or Wyatt Milam in the third round. If you take either of those two guys, you are signaling like, hey, Ezra, you're probably gone after this year, and this guy will be stepping in. If you take one of these two cats, I think it's to say, hey, they may be the starter down the line, but it's much more in the mold of Cooper Hodges. And speaking of Cooper Hodges, much like the Jaguars took a 7th-round flyer on the local product a couple years ago, these last 3 names, these are just dart throws. They're probably priority free agents that I just want to keep an eye on. Kevin already made fun of me. Of course, I'm going to say Connor Colby out of Iowa because, I mean, come on. He's a 4-year starter at Iowa along the offensive line. Those don't come around every other day, or let alone every other year. Ask Tristan Wirfs about that. He's not Tristan Wirfs, to be clear, despite the fact that they're both from the Cedar Rapids area. 6'6", 309, 5'11", 40-yard dash. He played right guard and left guard, strong hands, inside-outside zone guy. The pass blocking is a big question mark. He has a mullet. I want to make sure Taylor Dahl gets someone with a mullet. So please bring him in as a free agent, James, just so Taylor Dahl has her mullet man. And then he'd be from Iowa, and that's a great connection for me. The other 2 names, and this is in all seriousness, both the Western Michigan offensive linemen, I could see one of the 2, if not both, potentially getting a look in undrafted free agency or maybe as a 7th-round flyer like Cooper Hodges once upon a time because of Trevor Mendelson, who was brought in from Western Michigan on Liam Cohen's first coaching staff as an offensive assistant, was the offensive line coach at Western Michigan. So Addison West and Jacob Gideon are 2 names I would keep an eye on. West was a 3-year starter at right guard. Gideon started 48 games in 5 years, a 5-year starter at center. He only missed 3 games due to injury. 6'2", 296 for Gideon, 6'2", 300 pounds for Addison West. So they're both undersized. They didn't test great, but at the same time, they are both maulers in the run game. And much like Cooper Hodges, that was the talk coming out of App State. He is a mauler. He's a right tackle that's probably going to have to come inside. If you can develop him, you can't teach the work ethic and the motor. And if there's already a tie there, I could see the Jaguars taking a flyer late.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that's a really good shout out, especially because, like, obviously in general, it's smart to look out for connections between prospects and coaching staffs, just to have that familiarity. But I feel like especially for a team like the Jaguars, which we know they have not hosted any prospects on an official top 30 visit, which is partly to like not give away any signs of what they're doing so that teams don't have an idea of what specific players they want, but even like what positions they're targeting in certain rounds. But it's also to kind of avoid bias. Like they don't want to get into a room and like either have like confirmation bias either way, good or bad, and to like try to like overanalyze a player that's just in a short amount of time with meeting with them. But considering, again, especially for the Jaguars that don't have a lot of meetings with these players to try to remove bias, I think maybe there will be a little bit of bias with the guy on their staff from Western Michigan, but ideally it would be an unbiased opinion, and you just, at the end of the day, get a lot of clarity and a lot of information about what both of those 2 guys are about. And so I think, yeah, for sure, both of them are good names to watch.
To bring it full circle, the Jaguars also have a Michigan staffer on their staff. So file that one away, maybe even beyond Mason Graham, folks. That's an Easter egg.
I was going to say, like, I feel like that's a big reason that why not just Mason Graham, but also Josiah Stewart, even, I guess.
Come on, Gus. I was trying to hide the Easter egg of Josiah Stewart. Come on now.
I'm sorry. I couldn't help myself. I was already there. I was already in my head, or it was already in my head. But yeah, certainly a non-offensive lineman name to watch out for because of that connection. But also intangibly rich, I think that he makes a lot of sense even without the connection as a potential Jaguars draft prospect target. But yeah, any other names you want to throw out there, or did we get through the notebook?
The notebook is closed.
Nice.
We're on to next week. We'll probably talk about Josiah Stewart 1 week from today in our early morning final draft thoughts episode.
Right. In terms of the final thought for this exercise, just your final guess, I guess, in terms of where the Jaguars will take offensive linemen in this draft, how many picks will they spend on offensive linemen? And I guess the bigger question for me is, like, where do you think competition is going to exist after the NFL draft and entering the 2025 season for the Jaguars along their offensive line, because I think to me, it seems obvious that like Ezra Cleveland seems like the odd man out in terms of if someone is going to get beat out for a starting job in 2025, it would probably be Ezra. But John Osher, the team reporter for the Jaguars, said on 1010 a week or two ago that there's going to be an open competition at all 5 spots. And so, like, do you think that that's like a fair thing to say? And like, do you think there will be a competition across all 5 spots? But again, like, where do you think that there's like the most plausible space for a rookie to get immediate playing time on Jacksonville's 2025 offensive line?
Yeah, it has to be at left guard. And I think that that's because this idea of maybe Ezra's here for one more year. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's a trade candidate because he fit the previous regime's mold, not ours. I also think, and again, that's what I mentioned it earlier, you know, the name Donovan Jackson was floated to me. And this wasn't by anybody who will be making the decision on draft day, but I was just fascinated by that because I said, what about Patrick McCarry? And they paid a good amount of money for him, and he certainly can play multiple spots along the offensive line. But again, and you guys, and I've seen a couple of you quoting Tony Baselli in the comments throughout the duration of today's podcast. Yes, they just want to create competition, even if that means someone who they paid a lot of money for gets beat out. Okay. Oh, well, it doesn't matter to them. I think as much as I have said over the last 4 months, I believe the Jaguars would come away with 2 offensive linemen in the top 6 picks. As we've inched closer and closer to the NFL draft and seeing what they did in free agency and seeing what they did not do along the defensive line in free agency, it's more likely they take 3 defensive linemen in their first 6 picks than they take the 2 offensive linemen. I still think they take at least 1. We did this exercise on helmets and heels yesterday. I believe with their first 6 picks, the Jaguars will select at least 1 offensive lineman. I could see a 6th, 7th round player who maybe has a 5th round grade who falls and they take a second offensive lineman project there. But ultimately for me, I think that they've kind of made it known that they wanted to address the offensive line in free agency. And I think that speaks to a class that, while yes, there is certainly quality starting depth to be found, it's not this elite, there's just talent oozing off the top on the offensive line front. And so they'd rather save those throws at the dartboard for drafts to come. And the fact that they have Anton and Walker Little, and at this juncture, Ezra Cleveland as well, not to mention the 2 free agents, all under contract past this season, they probably want to see what they have in this group before they start changing things up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Very, very last question before we get out of here. This one's from Dell, a little bit off topic, but before we get out of here, do y'all think Cohen misspoke / forgot to mention Gabe Davis alongside Brown / Washington at the presser earlier this week? Wasn't sure if it was intentional to leave him out. Yeah, I think that he did not misspeak.
You did? Oh, wow. Wow.
So let me say, I have not gone back and listened to the presser, so maybe my opinion would change if I actually listened to it or if I was there in person for it. But to me, like, I think that, I don't know. I think that Cohen had probably thought about the answer beforehand, even if he didn't know that he was going to get that question at the presser. And so I think that I don't think he misspoke. But you seem surprised. You think that maybe he did?
I think that it was just like Liam being honest in the moment of like how they're lining up. Like, yeah, like Parker, we believe in Parker, so he's the first name I would think of, and then De'Ami Brown because he's going to create separation downfield. Like, I that part I think is honest. I don't think that's misspeaking, but I do think like the coach speak part of it, if he could go back, he probably would have said Gabe's name just to avoid the drama that has since, if only in the noise and in the ether has been created, I think he would have said his name.
Yeah, that's true. All right, episode 110. That'll do it. Almost an hour on a little bit of Gabe Davis, a little bit of Ashton Jeanty, but mostly the 2025 offensive line class and what it means for the Jacksonville Jaguars. We are 7 days away. I will be back for another episode of Duval Rundown tomorrow morning at 9:04 a.m. Eastern with Hacker. Mia will be back next Thursday as we do our day of the draft final thoughts. So certainly looking forward to that. Definitely check out our draft guide that we have on 1010xl.com if you're looking for more information of really any of the top 100 prospects in the class. Check out Mia's mock drafts on 1010xl.com as well. I assume your final Mia's mock will be this coming Monday, Mia?
Mm-hmm. Correct, yes.
So we got plenty of draft content already up, but plenty of draft content still to come over the next 7 days. So until next time, Mia, again, thanks as always. Thanks to all of our watchers and listeners. Adios, y'all. See you tomorrow.